The Majority Report with Sam Cedar.
Yes, it's Tuesday, April 11th, 2017. My name is Sam Cedar. This is the four-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live to tape. Steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On today's program, folks, whoa, we're mixing it up. It's one of our classic vacation shows where you get new material. Yes. How's that possible? Well, I don't know. But we just did it. Okay, that's a great story. On the program today, Michael Brooks, Majority Report contributor extraordinaire. We'll be interviewing Steve Cook on the situation in Syria. Obviously, we're recording this a couple of days before, so who knows what's happening. But important to get a good sense, at least a good foreign policy perspective on this. And then after Michael's interview, running an interview I did with Vicky Ward. She is a investigative journalist, columnist, writing in, I believe the piece was in The Nation magazine, or I'm not sure, about the Mercers. Rebekah and Robert Mercer, the biggest, one of the biggest sort of, I guess, billionaire forces in the Trump administration. Perhaps, I mean, by Tuesday, who knows? Maybe Steve Bannon is out. But Rebekah Mercer was the woman who convinced Bannon to stay, even though he got booted off the NSC. And this is an interview I did for Ring of Fire Radio. You can always check out Ring of Fire Radio. If you go to majority.fm, you could actually, it's a portal, and you can click on Ring of Fire there. It's a slightly different show. You'll notice that I approached the interview slightly differently. It's in two pieces. And I mentioned Ring of Fire Radio, obviously. But I thought you guys might be interested. The Mercer's very important background on this. You need to know. And we've included that interview here. You can always check out ringoffireradio.com. More on that, or just find it on iTunes if you want. Okay, so we're going to take a quick break. We've got new material for you on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday of this week. And, of course, Matt is dropping in special treats for our members. Small interview here or there. Deep archive shows from the original Majority Reports. I don't know what it is. It's a grab bag. It's like a potluck. But it is lucky. And Matt's probably high when he put it together. So potluck. Somebody's blushing. It's high right now. All right. Take a quick break. When we come back, Michael Brooks will be interviewing Steve Cook.
All right, welcome back to the Majority Report. I'm Michael Brooks. Joining us now, Steve Cook, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Steve, how you doing?
What's up, Michael?
Steve, a lot is up, and we're recording this a little bit ahead of time, and so people have to bear with us a bit. But the basic contours of what has happened in this past several days, is that there was a new chemical weapons attack that all evidence points to the Assad regime doing that. I know that there are many people who listen to this program who are, think that, might have some type of sort of conspiracy theory about maybe it was a depot they were hitting or something else. But all available evidence that we can sort of conceive of would point to Assad. Donald Trump had a complete reversal in his attitude. I mean, this is a couple of
complete reversal,
like a massive, an extraordinary about face. We had airstrikes. I mean, I want to get to some more of the context, but I just want, where does this leave us? I mean, are we basically just, for all of the, it seems to me that the biggest fallout might be people's ridiculous response in the United States. Even people who sometimes are very intelligent and savvy, like Fareed Zakaria, saying he's become the president. This really, really frustrating response to Trump taking this, about face. It seems like the actual airstrike, I don't know. Are we just going to be back to status quo in a couple of days? And maybe that's a good thing.
That's my sense, although you're getting a number of different signals coming out of the administration. So you have, for example, Nikki Haley, the U.S. representative to the UN, saying that this strike is a first step and we're prepared to do more. Now, she's somewhat of an outlier in the administration. She has from day one stepped it up in her rhetoric against the Russians. I think she clearly has her eyes on further political office and regards this forum in the UN as a way of kind of burnishing her credentials beyond an audience of one, being the President of the United States. But then you have people like the Secretary of State saying this is clearly a signal to the Assad regime. We can no longer envision a Syria with Assad in power, but then implying that the administration will take this to the Geneva negotiations, these kind of ongoing, never-ending, inconclusive negotiations that have been going on in Geneva. So there are a number of mixed signals, and I think what the problem with this strike is, and people have made arguments that it was the moral thing to do. Others have made the argument that this is just about Trump's lagging poll numbers. Whatever it is, I think that I think the
ding ding ding
the problem, it seems to me, is twofold. One, this hasn't really been thought through. It's that they put pictures in front of the president of the United States. He reacted emotionally and ordered up these missile strikes without thinking through the second and third order effects. And I think what's important when you are a policymaker is to think about the reactions both of your allies as well as your opponents. So I'm not imagining that the Russians have, since this missile strike, taken this lying down. In fact, almost immediately they started flowing Russian troops into and around strategic sites around Syria. The Iranians retained the capacity in response to this airstrike to make life very difficult for the United States and its allies around the region. And you can name those places: Bahrain, Yemen, Gaza, Iraq, Lebanon, a variety of places where they retain the option to cause a lot of pain. And I think that what this does is it raises the specter of escalation and getting the United States deeper involved in this conflict, for which there really isn't a big answer unless the President of the United States and the American people are willing to march an army into Damascus to discipline all the players there.
And of course, and
from our
that will create That will create a whole other disaster and a whole other set of unforeseen catastrophes. But I mean,
exactly.
And I just have to note parenthetically, I mean, this is just important to me because of the context we're in. I can't speculate about, Donald Trump's emotional state and what does and does not move him. But it's just extraordinary to me that at the very least, this isn't factored into analysis that, on television and sort of in the news cycle about this, that it looks like, okay, he saw this moral obscenity in Syria. But this is also a guy who's, issuing directives to loosen rules on airstrikes so that there's less accountability in terms of killing civilians. One of the first things he did as president was a massively irresponsible raid in Yemen that killed several children, including an American citizen. And then, the airstrike in Mosul that not only killed many civilians, also has actually sort of hurt the sort of Iraqi government's efforts against ISIS. So, to me, it's like, let's at least also remember who we're talking about here, before we start talking about his regarding Henry foreign policy,
No, I think that, I think, look, your skepticism is obviously well-deserved. This is a guy who 48 hours earlier, if reports are to be believed, was, playing footsie with the Assad regime.
Yeah.
They were, these reports of Representative Tulsi Gabbard, the Democrat from Hawaii,
right,
carrying messages between Trump and Bashar al-Assad. So no, I think the way I'm characterizing is the way in which it's been characterized as, restoring America's moral credibility. But it's very hard, as you point out, after, signing 2 executive orders trying to ban Muslims, including and mostly Syrian refugees from the country.
Exactly.
For, pushing, I think the language that I've heard from senior administration officials in terms of the fight against the Islamic State, we're in the annihilation phase, which is sort of loosened kind of the way any restrictions that the U.S. military has had in terms of civilian casualties in Mosul and other places. So yes, the skepticism is warranted, and that's why I think when you look at a lot of the analysis from the so-called blob, there is, in general, I think, an approval of this, but at the same time, there's also a lot of questions about what's next. My own view is that they took the shot at the Syrians, and now they're faced with the same exact disincentives, constraints, and conundrums that the Obama administration confronted in Syria. But the Trump team is at a disadvantage that they've now shot at the Syrians. So now there's this expectation created about further military action against the Assad regime, and I just don't think that they've thought it through.
Yeah, I mean, what a surprise that they haven't thought it through.
Speaking,
all right. I mean, but what?
I try to keep it professional here, and then you throw one of those things out.
I'm sorry. In this dynamic duo, I'm the troublemaker. So I take full responsibility. But look, okay. But okay, so that actually leads us to a question then about Assad specifically. So, and I just want to be clear again, because I know some members of the audience and in general, there's this sort of, again, I don't see, just as a broad metric, I don't understand the problem with saying that Russia's committed many atrocities in Syria. Iran has committed many atrocities. The Gulf states and all of the groups that they've supported commit atrocities. ISIS obviously commits atrocities. And to the extent we've been involved, we've armed groups that I wouldn't arm, and we have certainly killed civilians in airstrikes. So I would say a pox on all houses, a pox more on the Russian and Assad house, because they've done more, frankly. But let me just get that out of the way and just say that. So the evidence that Assad committed this strike is really clear. The Guardian is some of the only Western reporters on the ground there. They went and inspected the places that, were supposedly these chemical weapons depots that were hit in a conventional strike by the Assad forces. And they said that basically they were like abandoned agricultural buildings. There was maybe some old manure in them, not chemical weapons. And we also know, again, that the Assad regime has chemical stockpiles and apparently did not get rid of all of them, which they had committed to do in the 2013 agreement, and have continued, by the way, to use chlorine bombs for the last several years, which maybe weren't on the list, but, again, reinforce their willingness to do anything in pursuit of their objectives. Now, all that said, it is curious, and maybe it was just that they overread the signals from Tillerson and Trump, like, wow, we're really good here. We can really sort of, open the playbook and kind of escalate atrocities. But it seems if you have Russian support, the proxy war between, the Russians and the Iranians are beating the Turks in the Gulf states. Assad, at the very least, is solidified in large portion of the country and is apparently not going anywhere. And now you have an administration now starting to explicitly say, even just rhetorically, even though in some ways their policy wasn't dissimilar than Obama's at the end of his administration, it's up to the Syrian people what happens to Assad, which is exactly what the Russians have always said. Why would he take this moment? Because he has, for all of his crimes, played this whole thing pretty shrewdly.
Right.
Why the overplay? Like that is what's confusing to me.
Yeah, and I think that it's, a lot has been made of what Tillerson said and the signals coming out of the Trump administration about, no longer seeking regime change in Syria. And that makes some sense to me. But when you think more broadly about patterns in Syrian foreign policy, it strikes me that what they have been doing and what they have often done is tested their adversaries, tested people who have come into office. So they wanted to see what the Trump administration might do. Mm-hmm. And now they have a fairly good idea of it. You're going to take out an airfield, which, from what I understand, within 24 hours was once again operational. Right. And that's, it's not a huge price for the Assad regime to pay. They have always complied enough with their opponents while retaining options to continue to do the things that they've wanted to do. So it seems to me that's more of what was going on here than misreading the Tillerson message. Although I think it's entirely possible that played into their calculation as well.
So a calculated risk. I mean,
yeah, and I think the Assad regime has done that over and over again over the last 6 years.
Give some other examples of that for people to understand.
Well, I mean, the previous sarin attack in 2013,
right?
The daring the Turks with a variety of operations up and close to the Turkish border at the outset of the conflict, and even sponsoring some terrorist attacks within Turkey early on in the conflict. Those are the kinds of things that the Assad regime has done, the kind of wholesale killing, to see how the international community, the so-called international community, as problematic as that term is, would respond. And they've read the signals rather well that they could do these things generally with impunity. Trump is the new guy, and I think it was time to test him, and feeling confident that, whatever happened, the Russians and the Iranians would continue to support them. Look, there is, whenever the Russians say we don't unconditionally support Assad, mm-hmm. keep in mind that they may say that, but all of their actions has been to unconditionally support Assad.
Right. So, that then brings up, and again, I want to just sort of track the history here a little bit, because, and I also, my understanding is, and maybe this would be helpful as a way of tracking the history, the initial uprisings in 2011 were part of the sort of broader conflagration that was happening in the Middle East at that point. There were movements, as everybody can remember, across that region against dictatorships, against political corruption, against economic austerity, and for everything in terms of economic inequality, political reform, and everything else. And those movements in all countries were always very broad. They included, radical leftists, especially in a place like Syria, where there is actually like something of a left that still exists. There were certainly mm-hmm. Islamists. There were also just, people who weren't particularly political, but wanted to get food and not, be driven from their homes. How did this devolve? You had Assad's response, which was very violent and brutal out of the gate, kind of modeled after how his dad dealt with similar, uprisings. It seemed like you say the Obama administration had this sort of confidence that early on, that just like in some ways in Egypt and in Tunisia, that probably Assad was going to be on his way out. Somehow, during this process, not only did Assad brutally crack down on it, but it seems to me, and there is some reporting of this, that, he released some people from prison that were more, like Al-Qaeda types. Then the Gulf started, funding the opposition as it got armed. And then all of a sudden we do get into this situation where, the armed Sunni opposition is disproportionately, at the very least, religious right Muslims, and at worst, terrorists. So I guess, how did that process happen? Was it a combination of Assad's canniness in terms of who he wanted to set up and present to the international community as being his enemies, and then was it also just a product of outsourcing, basically funding of rebels to the Gulf states?
I think that's essentially the case. The Assad regime, the Assad family, had every incentive to try to fight their way out of this problem. As you point out, there was historical precedent his father and his uncle killed upwards of 25,000 people in the city of Hama during an uprising in 1982, and it was better for them to militarize the conflict because they believed they had superior firepower and could suppress the what was an uprising not terribly different from what had happened in Tunisia, in Egypt, and Libya, and other places around the region. And that as this situation developed, very shrewdly were the Assadists made it clear that they were fighting terrorists, and it kind of helped that process along by, one, as you point out, releasing people from prison, and then two, the Gulf states getting sucked into this, and it became this self-fulfilling prophecy. So an uprising, a peaceful uprising, became militarized, which became a civil war, which became a regional proxy war, which became a zone of jihadi violence, which then has now become a place of great power rivalry. And this has been the evolution, and that's why you have this vortex of violence that is destabilizing the Middle East and even destabilizing Europe. I think the Assadists have been extraordinarily shrewd. They understood how to play it, and they understood how the Russian experience in Chechnya could inform their own effort to shoot their way out of this problem.
Will you talk a little bit about the Chechnya connection a bit more? I think that it's helpful for people to understand.
Well, look, even throughout the period where the Russians were essentially out of the Middle East, there was a continued important relationship between the Russian government and the Syrian government, and that never went away. And in looking at their own history, and then looking at how the Russians dealt with Chechnya, basically with impunity, by framing the conflict in Grozny as one between the Russian government and Islamist extremists and extremism, and the conflict between the United States and the Russians over who's essentially created more extremists. Assad placed himself squarely with the Russians, and it provided an opportunity for the Russians to reestablish their influence around the region by coming in and supporting Assad. But Assad and the Assad regime and interlocutors with the Russians essentially spoke the Russian language on Chechnya, on the conflict in Grozny. And of course, from the Russian perspective, this is a region that is much, much closer to them than it is to the United States. And while we were celebrating uprisings and the coming of democracy in the Middle East, the Russians were deeply worried about the accumulation of Islamist political power in the aftermath of the fall of people like Hosni Mubarak, Ben Ali, Gaddafi, and potentially Assad, who continued to be their strategic link to the region.
Okay, so Steve, two more questions. One will
Sure.
be about something exciting that you have coming out in the future that we'll talk more about. But so I mean, this is an editorial disguised as a question. I mean, it seems to me that if the Trump administration or anybody has any sort of serious, the only real effort that the international community, the so-called international community, can take right now is, yes, there needs to be, even if it's not leading to anything, there at least needs to be some semblance of a diplomatic process to end this. And then the other thing is that conversely, and this, by the way, would have been, the evidence of a change in Trump, by the way, if people were looking for it. If he came out and said, look, I understand that pretty much there's not a military solution to this, and I've been saying that for a long time. I'm completely reversing this obscene policy that I ran on refugees. I understand that these people are human beings, and now after I've seen this tape, not only are we going to not do the Muslim ban and let more people in, I'm also going to invest the equivalent of an airstrike, night of airstrikes, which would be a significant amount of money, into, at the very least, shoring up support for refugees in Jordan, Lebanon, and so on. I mean, I guess that my point is that the most proactive realm that policy can take place in now would it be to just at the very least shore up and protect from the humanitarian fallout from this? Like, is that the area where something can actually be done?
Well, the Trump administration, to be fair, has talked about safe zones
Right.
in and around the Jordanian border and the Turkish border. But
Right.
that is actually a pretty significant investment of military resources to make
Right.
those things happen.
Right.
Who's going to defend them? Who's going to patrol them? And it does portend the possibility of escalation, because you can
Right.
imagine groups, whether it's Syrian government or others, attacking these safe zones. So
Right.
it's a problem. I think if I'm reading it correctly, Tillerson and others within the administration understand the fundamental problem at the heart of this is that we want a political solution. We want a negotiated exit for Assad. That is the best possible solution to this from everybody's perspective looking at it. But really the only way to bring about regime change in Syria is, as I said before, marching an army into Damascus and bringing him down, something that no politician, probably more than 2/3 of the American people, are going to be willing to do after our searing experience in Iraq over the course of the last 14 years or so.
Right.
So that's the fundamental problem. So they're talking tough. They're firing 59 cruise missiles at an airfield, an important airfield, and one of only 6 Syrian operational airfields. But it's going to take a lot more. And the diplomatic problem is that the Russians, the Iranians, aren't willing to give up on Assad, or they're only willing to give up on Assad once the conditions for his leaving no longer exist. And Assad has absolutely no incentive to negotiate because he knows that he can count on the Russians and the Iranians.
Right. So that's the stalemate.
There it is.
Steve, you have you're not known only for writing articles with me where we insult Bill Maher.
Happily.
Yes, very happily. Yes, it was a lot of fun. You have a book coming out. We're going to obviously talk about it more in depth soon when it's released, but give people a title and a brief tease.
Thanks so much for mentioning it, Michael. The book is called False Dawn: Protest, Democracy, and Violence in the New Middle East. And it's basically my take on how we got to this terrible moment in the Middle East. And it looks a bit at Syria and a bit at Iraq, but really the focus is on explaining the thwarted democratic transitions in places like Egypt, or why Libya ended up fragmenting, and how Tunisia, which has been reported as the great success story, is really a country that's teetering on the edge of either success or failure.
Mm-hmm.
And looks at the other great hope of the region. Remember all of the discussion about the Turkish model and how Turkey was going to provide the way forward for countries in the region. Well,
Yeah.
Turkey has experienced a resurgent authoritarianism. So it's my explanation as to how we got to this moment of failure in the Middle East. And interestingly, how the situations in places like Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and Turkey have contributed to violence in the same way that Syria and Iraq have also contributed to extremism and violence.
Okay, well, it sounds very important and very necessary and very depressing. And we'll be talking about it. Yeah, as soon as you.
People should drink it with a glass of wine.
Yes, done. Bank it. I look forward to reading it, and we'll talk about it when it comes out on the show.
Well, I appreciate that so
And
much.
obviously, be talking with you soon. And look forward to more calls from President Trump offering you a gig.
Thanks so much,
Because you
Michael.
do a great
Talk
job.
to you soon.
Talk to you soon. Thanks a lot. Stephen Cook, Council on Foreign Relations.
Welcome back to Ring of Fire Radio. I'm Sam Cedar. This presidential election cycle saw billionaires such as Paul Singer and the Koch brothers, never mind Sheldon Adelson, pull the purse strings from backing any of 24 characters that stood on that Republican stage during the primaries. But one secretive family decided that this was their time to spend millions on influencing hard-right policy and media in America. Our next guest has written an amazing expose on the secretive family led by Rebekah Mercer. Here to discuss her piece in the Huffington Post Highline magazine, The Blow It Up Billionaires, investigative journalist and New York Times bestselling author Vicky Ward. So we've heard a lot less, Vicky, of the Mercers than we have, I guess, some other Republican stalwarts. Sheldon Adelson makes a little cameo in your piece. Of course, the Koch brothers. There are others.
Right.
But give us a sense of when we talk about the Mercers, who are we talking about specifically from that family, and how long have they been this involved in Republican/conservative politics, I guess, /media?
Right. So people outside of the Republican world, the name Mercer is very new, right? We've all heard of the Kochs and Sheldon Adelson. You know, they've been around Republican politics for a long time. The Mercers matter in this context. That the two Mercers who matter are Robert Mercer, the 70-year-old former computer scientist who in his 50s became a very, very, very wealthy and successful hedge fund financier at a place called Renaissance Technologies, which is known for being a very sort of anti-establishment hedge fund. They typically don't recruit from Wall Street. They want different kinds of brains, and they've had extraordinarily good returns, and the sort of the algorithms and the data, you know, how they use data is all kept very secret. And it's quite a mysterious place. He's the one who has all the money. He then has a wife and 3 daughters. And the middle daughter, Rebekah Mercer, who's 43 years old and very tall and sort of striking looking, is much more articulate than her father, who is famously sort of reclusive. He much prefers talking to cats than to humans. And he has long held very, very right-wing views. You know, he's told people inside this hedge fund that he really believes that, you know, people who don't earn very much money, he doesn't sort of see them as worthwhile people. They don't add anything to society, that they're a kind of negative. And I think nobody who heard these views thought, sort of took them seriously until 2010. And in January 2010, the Citizens United decision gets passed, which of course changes the political landscape completely, because it means that individuals are now allowed, they can spend unlimited amounts of money on candidates and political think tanks and causes. And Bob Mercer uses, and this is when Rebekah, the middle daughter, who's, I think got 3 or 4 degrees from Stanford and spent a few years trading at her father's firm, but she's basically a housewife living in New York with who she homeschools her 4 children. So she has the time on her hands. They started to attend the Freedom Summits put together by the Kochs, who back then were the sort of linchpin of all these conservative mega donors. But I think they began, Rebekah, who is the talker of the two, felt increasingly frustrated that they were not sufficiently tough on trade and immigration. She also felt very annoyed that sort of she wasn't being listened to. And she really started to make a name for herself when Mitt Romney lost in 2012.
Vicky, let me just stop you there and back up just a little bit, because, it's interesting. So we have this reclusive guy who clearly does not sound like he's the type of person to set up some broad-based network. But when the shackles come off, where your own personal wealth is really all you need to sort of qualify as a political player, he begins to blossom. He does this through his daughter, Rebekah, who seems to function as his surrogate in some way. But do we have a sense of where do they come from? Are they from New York? Do they live in New York City? What do we know about Robert Mercer's childhood or where he came from? Because clearly these guys are movement conservatives, and they end up, I guess, around this time in 2010, donating is probably the wrong word, or perhaps it's not, investing in Breitbart, which I am particularly interested in.
2011. Yeah.
I'm particularly.
They start to see what their money can do. Yeah, and then they start to invest in these platforms. Breitbart was the first with the media platform, and then they buy this data analytics company.
How did they choose Breitbart? I asked this because I at that time followed Breitbart, the site and the man, quite closely. And that site was not making any money. And I remember when that secret, essentially, investment came in. I mean, I've looked at the filings over the years, and it was unclear where this money came in, but it came in one big lump sum, and he was ready to revamp the whole thing right before he died. But how did they just decide Breitbart? Was it just simply his politics? Because the interesting thing about Breitbart is, at that time, Breitbart was not at all interested, it seemed to me, in policy as much as he was sort of a cultural aggrievement.
That's exactly right. Andrew Breitbart was interested in changing the culture. He wanted, he was as obsessed with changing Hollywood as he was with everyone, everything else. So right there, that's what makes the Mercers. You asked me at the beginning, what makes the Mercers different? Okay? It's because they really want to blow up the entire system of American politics so that America, in their view, can regain its cultural roots, which they believe it has completely lost. They are terrified that America is becoming dangerously close to a sort of socialist Europe. And the America they want restored is the, sort of competition, enterprise. And they believe that the only sort of way, having, watched the Mitt Romney campaign lose, I think they believe that there's going to be a multi-pronged attack. Breitbart is one way to really hit the culture, okay? And after Andrew died, one of the reasons they then really trusted Steve Bannon, who took it over, was that, Steve Bannon is a former Goldman Sachs banker, and he did really, help right that ship financially. I mean, obviously he had their money, but it was a bit of a, I think it was much more precarious when Andrew was alive. He also, Steve Bannon, as we know, is this extraordinary populist, and he created it into a vehicle with a much more populist, widespread appeal. So that was right up what the Mercers wanted to do. But the other way, I think they really felt they needed to completely blow up. They just sort of thought the way Washington has been doing business needed to be exploded. And after Mitt Romney lost, Rebekah gave this speech saying that it was, she really thought he'd done a terrible job in terms of data and canvassing. And what's quite interesting, though, is her father then went out and bought, basically an English data analytics company.
Vicky, we've got to take a break right there. When we come back,
okay,
I want to hear more about this data enterprise that the Mercers went out to buy, and how much of that was a function of applying it to politics and how much was it a function of their business, or both, and talk a little bit more about how they ended up becoming essentially the one of the primary benefactors to the Trump campaign. We got to take a quick break. I'm talking to Vicky Ward. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio. Welcome back to Ring of Fire Radio. I'm Sam Seder. Right now I'm talking with Vicky Ward about her piece in the Huffington Post Highline magazine, The Blow It All Up Billionaires. So, Vicky, at the break, you were telling us the story of how Rebekah Mercer and her less, I guess, forward-leaning, or maybe not forward-leaning, but less public father, Robert Mercer, billionaire, entered into the orbit of the Trump campaign. And one thing, before we go forward, I mean, because you've told us the story of, and you've written about the Mercers as, in some respects, based upon Robert Mercer's exchange with Sheldon Adelson, Rebekah Mercer's, I guess, interactions with people in the Koch network, and particularly following the Romney loss, that they were people who had a sense of aggrievement towards the fancy people in some way. And
totally.
It made their investment in Breitbart somewhat understandable, because Breitbart, I think, also personally felt aggrieved that he was left out of the cool kid club in Hollywood, and much of what he did in the so-called conservative movement was really a reaction to feeling rejected by the cool club. And he grew up in the shadow of Hollywood, California, and that became the real center of his ire. But what do you know about Robert Mercer as a child? I mean, there doesn't seem to be much out there about how he grew up to develop.
You're entirely right. I mean, all we know that's obviously quite interesting is that, he is obviously a very brilliant scientist. I mean, what got him into finance, he had to be, I did speak to the English man, Nick Patterson, who persuaded him to come and work at this hedge fund. And he sort of had to be persuaded, but at the time he was studying computational linguistics. And Nick Patterson, this British guy, thought that he could use the same sort of algorithms would work in finance. What we do know is that I think very early on he was recruited to do some work, I think, for the American Army. And I'm telling you this from memory. So and he found it. He has said publicly that he thought that working for the American government was enlightening, and that he considered it to be an extremely wasteful, inefficient process. And so there certainly were some seeds, if you like, for his position on, the need for very, very small, if any, government. He also, we do know, I mean, again, people have said to me he prefers artificial, at the end of the day, he's rather, he's a data wonk. He would, he believes more in the validity, if you like, of artificial intelligence than he does than on humans. So you're dealing with, a scientist who never got the chance until 2010 to sort of get out there and put his money to work and test a combination of science and politics on the world. And now, he has tested it, and the results, are quite extraordinary.
So we don't have too much time left. So let's jump from these. The Mercers initially backed Ted Cruz, and it seems that along the way they got somewhat disillusioned with Cruz because in some respects he may have been too soft for them in some respects.
That's exactly
and it
right.
also seems that the Cruz people also became disillusioned with the Mercers because much of the money they had given them was then having to be funneled back into this analytics.
Yeah, it was a classic hedge. It was a business play, exactly. So the data company that the Mercers had invested in, it was sort of this unspoken quid pro quo that the Cruz team were forced to use, and had real issues with how expensive they were. Some of the people I think they found to be very, very good, but they found the CEO to be incredibly irritating and the sums of money to be exorbitant. And as you say, it became quite clear that Steve Bannon, who was talking all the time to the Mercers, felt that Ted Cruz was too soft on immigration and on trade. And when he was done, the Mercers switched, and the Mercers were furious with Ted Cruz for not endorsing Donald Trump at the Republican convention. So they gave out a public statement and very quickly started donating to Donald Trump. But what was really pivotal was this extraordinary meeting that Rebekah Mercer, the Trump campaign was having all sorts of problems, a lot of negative press, right down in the polls. In July, August, Paul Manafort was having all sorts of issues. There was story after story about his involvement, that he'd taken money from, dodgy money from Ukraine. And Rebekah Mercer printed out a New York Times article, a series of other articles, and arrived at this fundraiser in East Hampton, New York, and stood in front of Donald Trump. And she remembered he knew who she was, but didn't know her well. She stood in front of him for 30 minutes and said, look at all this. Here is what you need to win. You need my man, Steve Bannon. You need Kellyanne Conway, who had worked for the Mercers as a pollster. And this is what you've got to do. And because he listened to her, not least because she had just given him some money, which he needed at that point. And 4 days later, he hired Steve Bannon and Kellyanne Conway. And about a month after that, they hired David Bossie, who was also very close to the Mercers. And, you know, the rest is history, as I say. The Trumps did win. But then, of course, Rebekah Mercer puts herself, well, you know, she then, unlike Sheldon Adelson or any of the other big donors, is on the executive committee of the transition team. You don't see that usually. And she's pushing very hard for all the people she believes in to get jobs. And that's not normal. And she's making life, you know, she's very vocal when she doesn't get what she wants. And then she's pushing and pushing and pushing to run one outside group that's going to, as she put it to people, hold the president and the people I got elected accountable.
Well,
and which I think
Vicky,
is sort of rather scary phrasing.
Okay, well, we're out of time, but folks should check out this piece if they want a clearer notion. And it also gives a sense of what's happening when you start to see Breitbart, the site, criticize what's going on with this health care bill and attacking Paul Ryan from the outside. It's a fascinating dynamic, and I'm sure there will be more to hear and talk about in the future. Vicky Ward, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you.
Vicky Ward is an investigative reporter and New York Times bestselling author. She was a contributing editor of Vanity Fair for 12 years, and currently she writes for Esquire, Town & Country, and the Financial Times. You can read her piece, The Blow It All Up Billionaires, over at highline.huffingtonpost.com.